I found out. My boyfriend was testing me, so I failed him on purpose. At first, I thought it was sweet. The way he said it so plainly, so confidently, like it was a personal philosophy he'd carved into stone long before he met me. Loyalty is everything to me. And the first time he said it, we were sitting across from each other in a small coffee shop in downtown Chicago. Condensation sliding down our iced drinks while late afternoon sunlight spilled through the windows. And I remember smiling because in a world where dating felt like a never-ending audition full of half-truths and situationships, someone claiming to value loyalty felt like relief, like safety, like a promise that if I chose him, I wouldn't have to constantly look over my shoulder, wondering where I stood. And maybe I should start from the beginning, because context matters, especially when people later ask me why I didn't see it coming sooner. So I'm 26, I work in marketing for a mid-sized tech company, and I met him at a friend's birthday rooftop party last summer. One of those warm evenings where the city feels almost gentle, music humming low, drinks in plastic cups, conversations overlapping, and he wasn't the loudest guy in the room or the flashiest. He was calm, observant, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, which immediately set him apart. And when we started talking, it didn't feel forced or performative. It felt easy, like we were both tired of the same dating scripts and had quietly agreed to skip them. He asked me real questions about my job, my family, what I wanted long term. And when I asked him the same, he told me he'd been burned before, cheated on by someone he thought he'd marry, and he said it without bitterness, just as a fact, like a scar he'd accepted. And that was the first time he said it. That loyalty line, almost offhandedly, like a principle he lived by rather than a demand he made. And I remember thinking, okay, this makes sense. This is a man who knows what he wants. And when we exchanged numbers and started seeing each other more regularly, dinners turning into late night walks, walks turning into weekends together, that theme kept coming up, woven into conversation so smoothly I didn't notice how often it appeared. He'd say things like, I just think loyalty is the foundation of any real relationship, or I don't need much, just honesty and loyalty. And I nod, agree, because who wouldn't? And in those early weeks, it felt reassuring, especially compared to past relationships where I'd felt like an option rather than a choice. And he was attentive in a quiet way, remembered small details, texted consistently but not obsessively, showed up when he said he would. And when he eventually asked me to be his girlfriend, it felt natural, like a step we were already halfway into, and that's when the conversation started getting deeper, or at least that's how I interpreted them at the time. He liked talking about values, about what makes someone trustworthy, about the kind of partner he wanted to be and expected in return. And at first, it felt like emotional intimacy, like we were building something intentional rather than just drifting. But looking back now, I can see how those talks slowly shifted in tone, how they stopped being mutual explorations and started feeling more like evaluations. Though at the time I couldn't have articulated that, not yet. It started subtly, with questions that felt hypothetical, almost playful, like one night when we were cooking dinner together and he casually asked, what would you do if a guy who made way more money than me started flirting with you? And I laughed, rolled my eyes, told him I wasn't impressed by money and that I'd shut it down, and he smiled, nodded, but didn't laugh with me. Instead, he said, yeah, that's good, because loyalty isn't about circumstances. And something about the way he said good stuck with me, like I'd answered correctly, but I brushed it off, told myself I was overthinking, because he wasn't accusing me of anything, just asking. And those kinds of questions kept coming, spaced out enough that they didn't feel obsessive, always framed as hypotheticals or philosophical debates. Do you think it's ever okay to hide something from your partner? If someone cheats emotionally but not physically, is that still cheating? What would you do if you found out your partner was lying to test you? And that one made me pause. I remember setting my phone down and asking him why he'd even think about that. And he shrugged, said, I just like to understand how people think. And again, at the time, I accepted that explanation because it sounded thoughtful, introspective even, and because nothing in his behavior screamed danger, he wasn't controlling in obvious ways. He didn't tell me what to wear or who I could see. He didn't check my phone or accuse me outright. Instead, he watched, observed, filed things away quietly. And the more invested I became, the more I wanted to believe his intentions were pure, that he was just cautious because he'd been hurt. And there were moments when his focus on loyalty even made me feel chosen, like he saw me as someone worth protecting himself for. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, I started noticing how aware he was of my reactions, how his eyes lingered on my face after certain answers, how he'd go quiet sometimes, not angry, just contemplative, like he was recalibrating something internally. And there were times I'd catch myself explaining answers I hadn't even given yet, just to make sure I sounded right, which should have been a red flag, But when you're inside a relationship, those realizations don't arrive with warning labels. They creep in disguise as self-doubt. And I told myself it was normal to want your partner's approval, that it meant I cared. And around this time, he started framing loyalty almost like a muscle that needed to be tested, saying things like, everyone says they're loyal until they're tempted, and I'd counter with, or maybe loyal people just don't entertain temptation. And he'd smile at that. But again, there was that measuring look, that silent assessment, and I began to feel like there was an invisible scorecard I couldn't see but was constantly being updated. And still, I stayed, because on the surface, everything was good. We laughed, we had chemistry, our lives fit together easily, and no one warns you that manipulation doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in principles you already agree with, and then came the night that really shifted something inside me. Though I didn't realize it fully until later, we were lying in bed, lights off, that comfortable post-midnight quiet where conversations drift into honesty, and he said, I think people reveal who they are when they think no one's watching. And I agreed, and then he added, that's why loyalty matters so much to me. It's about what you do when you could get away with something. And there was a pause, heavy enough that I turned to look at him and he was already looking at me, eyes sharp in the dim light, and I felt this sudden, irrational urge to defend myself, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. And I said, you know, I wouldn't hurt you like that. And he reached out, brushed my hair back, said softly, I know, I just need to be sure. And that sentence lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest, because what does it mean to need to be sure of someone who hasn't given you a reason to doubt them? But again, I stayed quiet, because questioning it felt like questioning his trauma, and I didn't want to be the kind of person who dismissed that. So days passed, then weeks, and life went on. Work deadlines, brunch with friends, gym routines, normal things. Except that low-level feeling of being observed never fully went away, like I was performing without knowing the script. And then one afternoon, on a completely ordinary Tuesday, while I was waiting for my coffee order and half scrolling through my phone, my Instagram notification popped up. New message request. And I almost ignored it, because I usually do, but the profile picture caught my eye. A well-dressed guy, confident smile, blue checkmark next to his name, verified, which immediately made my brain do that stupid thing where it pauses a second longer than it should. And I opened it, and the message was simple, casual. Hey, I saw your profile and thought you seemed interesting. And my first reaction wasn't excitement or flattery, it was confusion, because I don't post thirst traps. My account is private, mostly friends and travel photos and the occasional mirror selfie, and I stood there holding my phone, coffee forgotten, with this strange, creeping sensation settling in my stomach, not because a guy messaged me. Men message women online all the time, but because of the timing, because of the questions, because of the way my boyfriend had been watching me lately. And as I stared at that DM, something inside me shifted from warmth to unease, like the air before a storm. And I had no idea yet that this single message was the first crack in everything I thought I understood about my relationship. But I felt it, that instinctive tightening, the quiet warning that something wasn't right, and that was where it began. I didn't reply to the DM right away, and that alone should tell you how unsettled I felt, because normally I'd either ignore it completely or shut it down without a second thought. But this time I just stared at the screen, reread the message, clicked on the profile again, scrolled through his photos, professional looking shots, events, travel, clean comments, nothing obviously fake. And the blue checkmark made it feel more real, more intentional. And I told myself I was being paranoid, that my boyfriend's loyalty talks were just coincidence, that the world doesn't revolve around my relationship. But that night when I met my boyfriend for dinner, he looked at me a second too long when I unlocked my phone to show him a picture from work. Not suspicious, exactly, just attentive, like he was cataloging something. And halfway through the meal, he casually asked, do you get a lot of random DMs? And my stomach dropped so fast, I almost laughed out of reflex, because the timing was too clean, too aligned. And I answered honestly, but vaguely, said, not really. And he nodded, took a sip of water, and said, good. Because attention is cheap these days, loyalty isn't. And there it was again, that word, landing heavier than it should have. And when I went home that night, I didn't sleep much. My brain replaying every interaction from the past few weeks like surveillance footage, noticing details I dismissed before, how his questions had sharpened, how his hypotheticals had grown more specific, how he'd once joked about how easy it is to create fake personas online. And the next morning, the DM was still there, unanswered, and then another message came in. Polite, confident, not pushy. Didn't mean to bother you, just thought I'd say hi. And I felt this strange mix of irritation and curiosity. Not toward the guy, but toward the situation itself. Like I was standing inside a setup I didn't fully understand yet. And that day, my boyfriend texted more than usual, checking in, asking how my morning was, what I was up to, small things, but threaded together, they felt like a pulse check. And that evening, he asked me a question so specific it made my skin prickle. Do you think responding to someone is the same as entertaining them? And I remember pausing before answering, choosing my words carefully, saying something neutral about intention mattering, and he replied, exactly. Like I just confirmed a hypothesis. And that's when the suspicion crystallized into something sharper, because this wasn't just insecurity. This felt orchestrated, like variables being introduced to see how I'd react, and once that thought lodged itself in my mind, I couldn't unsee the patterns. The way the DM timing lined up with his mood shifts, the way his questions mirrored scenarios I was actively experiencing, and I started paying closer attention. Not confrontationally, but quietly, like an observer instead of a participant. And the more I watched, the more the pieces aligned uncomfortably well, because the DM guy escalated just enough to stay interesting. Compliments about my work after he happened to notice my LinkedIn in my bio, comments about how refreshing it was to meet someone low drama, invitations phrased casually enough to deny intent, and every escalation was followed by a conversation with my boyfriend that felt like a response, not a coincidence. Would you tell me if someone made you feel special? Do you think loyalty is about behavior or mindset? And I started feeling like I was trapped inside a psychological maze where every move was being measured. And the worst part was how calm my boyfriend seemed, how certain, like he was already confident in the outcome. And that's when the internal conflict really set in, because a part of me wanted to confront him outright, to say, are you testing me? To force the truth into the open. But another part of me, the quieter, colder part, wanted to know how far this went, wanted to see what he thought loyalty actually meant, because something told me this wasn't about whether I cheat. It was about whether I'd submit, and that realization scared me more than the DM ever could. So instead of confronting him, I made a choice that surprised even me. I decided to respond, not impulsively, not emotionally, but deliberately, like a controlled experiment. And I want to be very clear here, because Reddit loves to jump to conclusions. I didn't flirt, I didn't lie, I didn't cross any explicit lines, but I also didn't shut it down. I replied politely, with the same tone I'd use with a coworker or acquaintance, neutral, friendly, engaged just enough to keep the conversation alive, and almost immediately I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. The responses came fast, almost too fast, like the person on the other end was waiting. And within minutes of my reply, my boyfriend texted me asking how my evening was going, and I stared at my phone with this hollow feeling in my chest, because now it felt undeniable that I was part of something staged. And over the next 2 days, the pattern intensified. The DM guy complimented my boundaries, said he respected that I was selective, and my boyfriend, unprompted, talked about how temptation often disguises itself as respect. The alignment was surgical, precise, and I started documenting it mentally, timestamps, phrasing, emotional beats, because once you suspect manipulation, you don't react emotionally, you gather data, and the more data I gathered, the calmer I became. Which might sound strange, but clarity does that. It drains fear and replaces it with a resolve. And by the third day, I wasn't questioning whether this was intentional anymore. I was questioning why my partner felt the need to trap me instead of trusting me, why loyalty had to be proven under artificial pressure, and why he seemed almost eager for me to fail. And that's when I understood something crucial. This test wasn't designed for me to pass easily. It was designed to validate his worldview, that everyone eventually slips, that control equals safety. And by choosing not to shut the DM down immediately, by existing in that gray space he was so obsessed with defining, I wasn't betraying him, I was revealing him. And I don't think he realized yet that the moment he turned love into an experiment, the outcome stopped being about my loyalty and started being about his character. And as I sent one more neutral reply and set my phone down, heart steady but mind racing, I knew this situation was reaching a breaking point. Because tests always are, and whatever came next was going to expose something irreversible. He didn't ease into the confrontation the way people do when they're uncertain or afraid of what they might hear. He came at me like a prosecutor who already believed he'd won. And the moment I walked into his apartment that evening, I could feel it in the air. Thick and charged, his jaw tight, his movements clipped, the television off even though he always had something playing in the background. And before I could even set my bag down, he said my name in that sharp, formal tone people use when they're about to say something rehearsed. And I remember thinking, almost distantly, that this was it. This was the moment he'd been building toward. And he didn't ask how my day was or if I wanted to sit. He just said, we need to talk. And when I nodded, calm in a way that surprised even me, he launched straight into it, asking me why I'd been entertaining another man, why I thought it was appropriate to respond to messages from someone who was clearly interested, while I hadn't shut it down immediately if I was truly loyal. And as he spoke, he paced, energy sharp and contained, like anger trying to stay respectable. And I noticed how precise his words were, how little room he left for interpretation, as if he'd already decided what my actions meant and was only allowing me to hear the verdict, not participate in the trial. And when I asked him to slow down, to explain exactly what he was talking about, he pulled out his phone and held it up between us like evidence. Screenshots already queued, my Instagram messages laid out neatly, timestamps highlighted, selective cropping that told the story he wanted told. And he said this, like it was self-explanatory, like I should look at my own words and feel ashamed. And I glanced at the screenshots and felt something strange and unexpected. Not panic, not guilt, but a kind of quiet confirmation, because seeing them in his hand, curated and ready, erased the last sliver of doubt I'd been holding onto. And he went on, voice rising now, talking about boundaries, about respect, about how disappointing it was to see me fail something so basic. And I caught the word fail immediately, the way it slipped out naturally, comfortably, like he'd been waiting to use it. And that was when he said it outright, no longer pretending this was a misunderstanding. I needed to know if I could trust you, he said. And instead of shutting it down, you engaged. And I remember tilting my head slightly, studying him, because there was something almost triumphant in his anger, like the confirmation of a long-held belief. And when I asked him, calmly, who exactly this man was to him, why he had access to my messages in the first place, his anger shifted, flickered into something defensive, and he exhaled hard before saying, "He's my friend." And there it was, the confession delivered like a footnote, like a detail that mattered less than the conclusion he'd already drawn. And he explained it quickly, too quickly, how he'd asked his friend to message me, how it was just a test, how he needed to be sure because he'd been hurt before and couldn't afford to be wrong again, how loyalty only means something when temptation is real. And as he talked, justifying, rationalizing, reframing his actions as caution rather than control, I felt myself detach emotionally in real time, like a cord being unplugged quietly but completely, because hearing it confirmed what my intuition had been screaming for days. And once the truth was out in the open, it lost its power to shock me. And instead of reacting the way he clearly expected, crying, apologizing, scrambling to explain myself, I stayed still, listening, letting him talk himself into circles. And I could see the confusion start to creep into his expression, because anger feeds on resistance, and I wasn't giving him any. And when he finally paused, waiting for my defense, I said something that changed the entire dynamic of the room. I said, "So you orchestrated a situation, monitored my responses, and decided I failed because I didn't behave exactly the way you wanted." And my voice was steady, almost curious, and he bristled, saying I was missing the point, that this wasn't about control, it was about trust, about standards, about protecting himself. And that's when I realized how deeply he believed his own narrative, how thoroughly he'd reframed manipulation as morality. And I told him, still calm, "You didn't test my loyalty." And he interrupted, starting to argue, but I held up my hand, not aggressively, just firmly, and finished, "You tested my tolerance." And the effect was immediate and devastating. Like a switch flipped, his posture faltered, his certainty cracked, because that sentence reframed everything in a way he couldn't easily dismiss. And I continued, explaining that loyalty isn't proven by navigating traps, that trust doesn't come from surveillance, that love doesn't require experiment. And as I spoke, I watched his face cycle through disbelief, frustration, and something like fear, because for the first time since this began, he wasn't in control of the narrative. And I could tell he was scrambling internally, trying to regain moral high ground, saying things like, "If you had nothing to hide, this wouldn't bother you." And any loyal person would have shut it down immediately. And I responded evenly, any trusting partner wouldn't have set it up in the first place. And there was a long silence after that, the kind that stretches and exposes everything underneath. And in that silence, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. Not anger, not sadness, just the clean understanding that whatever we'd had before this moment no longer existed. Because trust, once replaced with tests, doesn't regenerate. And I told him I was done. Not dramatically, not as a threat, just as a fact, and he looked genuinely stunned, like he'd expected tears or negotiation or remorse, not resignation. And he started backpedaling, softening his tone, saying he'd only done it because he cared, because he saw a future with me, because he needed certainty. And I listened without interrupting, noticing how quickly moral superiority turned into pleading when control slipped away. And when he finished, I said, "You didn't see a future with me, you saw a hypothesis." And that landed harder than anything else I could have said, because it named the truth he'd been avoiding. And I stood up, picked up my bag, and as I walked toward the door, he asked me if I really thought this was worth ending everything over, and I turned back one last time and said, "You ended it the moment you decided to test me instead of trust me," and I left. Heart steady, steps unhurried, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever pain came after would be cleaner than staying in a relationship where love was conditional and loyalty was something to be measured under artificial pressure. And that was the moment the power shifted completely. Not because I won an argument, but because I refused to participate in a game I never agreed to play. The breakup itself didn't look dramatic from the outside. No screaming match, no slammed doors, no tear-soaked pleas, just a quiet finality that settled in my chest the moment I stepped into the hallway and felt the door close behind me. And in the days that followed, I kept waiting for the emotional collapse everyone warns you about, the delayed shock, the urge to call him and explain myself better to make him understand that I hadn't betrayed him. But that urge never came, because there was nothing left to clarify. The truth had been exposed cleanly and completely, and instead of grief, what I felt was something closer to grief's opposite. A strange calm that bordered on relief, like finally exhaling after holding my breath without realizing it. And when friends asked me what happened, I didn't give them the dramatic version. I didn't frame myself as a victim or him as a villain. I just said, he tested me instead of trusting me, and watched their expressions shift from confusion to concern to anger on my behalf. Because when you say it out loud, stripped of justification and tone softening, the behavior sounds exactly as invasive as it was. And some of them was asked why I didn't just shut the DM down immediately if I knew something was wrong, why I didn't confront him sooner, and I answered honestly that I wanted to understand what kind of man I was dealing with before I invested another ounce of emotional labor. That confrontation only works when both people are operating in good faith, and he wasn't. He was running an experiment, and experiments reveal truths whether you interfere with them or not. And that understanding became the anchor I returned to whenever doubt tried to creep in during those first quiet weeks alone. Because there were moments, usually late at night, when my brain replayed his words, his certainty, his belief that loyalty had a single correct shape. And I had to remind myself that love doesn't feel like a test you can fail by existing imperfectly. Love doesn't require you to preemptively defend yourself against accusations that haven't been made yet. And manipulation, I learned, isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in values you already believe in, using language that makes you question yourself instead of the person asking the questions, and that realization reframed the entire relationship. In hindsight, all those conversations I thought were deep now look strategic. All those hypotheticals now felt like dry runs. And instead of mourning the relationship, I mourned the version of it I'd believed in, the one where loyalty was mutual rather than monitored. And during that time, I didn't reach out to him and he didn't reach out to me. A clean silence stretched across 2 full months, long enough for my nervous system to reset, long enough for the constant feeling of being evaluated to fade, long enough for me to rediscover how light life feels when you're not subconsciously auditioning for someone's approval. And I filled that space with small acts of reclamation, long runs with music turned up too loud, dinners with friends where I laughed without filtering my words, weekends where my phone stayed face down and untouched. And somewhere in the middle of that silence, I realized I hadn't once felt the urge to prove anything. Not my loyalty, not my intentions, not my innocence. Because the moment you feel compelled to prove yourself in a relationship, the foundation is already cracked. And then one evening, exactly 2 months after the breakup, his name appeared on my phone, and I stared at it for a full minute before opening the message. Not because I was tempted, but because I was curious, and the message was long, carefully written, apologetic in tone if not in substance. He said he'd been reflecting, that therapy had helped him understand his trust issues, that he knew now he'd gone about things the wrong way, that he missed me, that what we had was rare, and that he hoped we could talk, really talk. And reading it, I felt nothing surge, no anger, no longing, just a quiet confirmation of the decision I'd already made. Because even in apology, he framed the problem as his method, not his mindset, as execution rather than entitlement. And I understood then that the issue wasn't that he'd tested me, it was that he believed he had the right to. And so I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because engagement would have implied there was something left to negotiate, and there wasn't. And the next morning, another message came through. Shorter this time, more emotional, saying he'd never meant to hurt me, that he only did it because he was afraid of losing me. And I thought about how fear can turn into control when left unexamined, how insecurity can masquerade as principle, and I blocked him, decisively, without ceremony, because boundaries don't require explanation, once they've been crossed, and blocking him didn't feel like an act of anger. It felt like closing a door that no longer led anywhere I wanted to go, and now, with enough distance to see the full arc of it, I don't regret how I handled any part of that situation. Not the observation, not the restraint, not even the choice to respond politely to the DM, because it revealed exactly what needed to be revealed. And if there's one thing I want anyone reading this to understand, it's that trust isn't proven by surviving traps, it's built through mutual respect. And loyalty isn't something you earn by passing tests designed in secret, it's something that exists naturally when both people feel safe. And I didn't fail him. Not really. I simply refused to succeed at being controlled, and some tests don't deserve a second attempt. The end. This story hits hard, not because it's explosive, but because it's quietly devastating. What really stood out to me is that the main character didn't win by yelling, exposing, or humiliating anyone. She won by refusing to perform. And that's something a lot of people don't realize until they've been through it themselves. The moment you're being tested in a relationship, the relationship is already broken. This wasn't about loyalty, it was about control dressed up as values, about insecurity pretending to be principle. And the calm way she handled it, that's real strength. No need to prove innocence. No need to defend character. When someone sets traps instead of boundaries, walking away is the only answer that keeps your self-respect intact. I also love how this story shows that closure doesn't always come from conversation. Sometimes it comes from silence, from choosing peace over explanation, from blocking instead of debating. Fools, if you're listening to this and something feels familiar, trust that feeling. Love shouldn't feel like an exam you didn't sign up for. If you enjoyed this story and want more real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories like this, make sure to like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.